Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Jamie Monson. I'm the director of the African Studies Center at Michigan State University, and I'm the co-PI together with my colleague, Bongani Mgijima from Stellenbosch University for the Ubuntu Dialogues project. On behalf of the whole Ubuntu Dialogues team, I want to warmly welcome you and thank you for making time to join us for our first web-based Ubuntu Dialogue seminar today. In my welcoming and opening remarks, I'll first provide an overview of the Ubuntu Dialogues project, paying special attention to this seminar exchange component. Then I'll end by introducing the chair for today's webinar, and he will go on to introduce today's speakers. I'm sure most of you are aware that the Ubuntu Dialogues is a partnership project between MSU's African Studies Center and the Stellenbosch University Museum, and it's generously funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. This partnership is imagined around Ubuntu, an African sociocentric philosophy premised upon collective humanity and interdependence. Our project has three parts. We have virtual student conversations, we have an internship exchange program for students, and this seminar exchange program for scholars. Our student conversations bring together Stellenbosch students and MSU students in a virtual space who are selected from historically marginalized and underrepresented minoritized backgrounds to discuss critical issues that face young people in today's world. Our exchange internship program for students places the Stellenbosch University students and the MSU students in cultural heritage institutions in the US in South Africa, where they gain global community engaged learning experiences. And this seminar program, which we're here for today, takes the form of transnational intellectual engagement among graduate students, scholars, and museums and heritage professionals. The focus of these seminars is on institutional histories, on the meaning of Ubuntu, Pan-Africanism, knowledge production, and institutional decolonization and transformation through both concepts and practice. Before the pandemic shut down international travel, we had already been able to hold 4 in-person exchange seminars. These initial presentations focused on the themes of trauma, forgiveness, and reparations, on Ubuntu aesthetics in the context of 20th century Black urban life in South Africa, on the opportunities and challenges of Ubuntu in the South African land reform context, and on how hip-hop has created cultural capital in the absence of structural resources. Today's seminar is the first in our new series of web-based seminars, and we will continue to hold these until international travel restrictions are lifted. The next 2 seminars in the series are scheduled for October 14th and November 11th, and we hope you will join us for those. The wonderful thing about having seminars in the virtual space is that physical distance doesn't prevent the participation of people from literally all over the world. We have participants today from Europe, from different African countries, and from the United States, including some of our US partners, for example, UW-Madison and Northwestern, who we hope will continue to collaborate with us on these and other events. We're also proud and happy to announce that we are recruiting for the second cohort, for the 2021 cohort of exchange seminar participants. We'll be recruiting 8 participants, 4 from MSU and the United States, and 4 through Stellenbosch University. Applicants could be academics, professionals, or graduate students in museums or university settings anywhere in the United States and South Africa. And we're especially interested in individuals whose research and work informs, adds to, or complicates the concept of Ubuntu in 3 primary areas. 1, responses to persisting patterns of institutional racism. 2, the COVID-19 pandemic. And 3, debates on institutional and knowledge decolonization. We'll be sending out word about the CFP on our websites and also to our email lists. If you have questions and if you're not yet on our email list, please reach out to me or to our project manager at Michigan State University, Upenyu, or to Musa Padi, who's the project manager at Stellenbosch University Museum. So let's now turn to today's webinar. Our chair and moderator will be Dr. John Arne Flessner, who is an associate professor in the Residential College of the Arts and Humanities at Michigan State University. Professor Arne Flessner obtained a PhD in African and World History from Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. His research has focused on youth, nationalism, development, borders, and decolonization in Lesotho. His first book is entitled Dreams for Lesotho: Independence, Foreign Assistance, and Development. And his new project is a history of the Lesotho-South African border from the 19th century to the present. John writes with frequency about contemporary politics in Lesotho for Southern African media outlets such as the Mail and Guardian and the Daily Maverick, and he also tweets extensively about Lesotho and about Southern African politics, history, and development. He teaches courses on global slavery, decolonization, music and popular culture in 20th century Africa, the history of public health in Africa, and also about Malcolm X and urban renewal in Lansing, Michigan. Please join me in extending a very warm welcome to Professor John Arne Flessner. Welcome, John.
Thank you to Jamie for that, and thank you to everyone for being here today on the first of the Ubuntu dialogues with the collaboration between Michigan State and Stellenbosch. Without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our two speakers for today so we can jump right into the presentations and hopefully have a robust conversation to save time so that we can get to the question and answer portion of today's. If you are having questions along the way or as the speakers are talking or afterwards, you can enter them in the Q&A, which should be an option down at the bottom of your screen on the Zoom webinar. So we will be monitoring those and getting those ready for the participants. So our participants today, first joining us, who will be presenting first, is Unifier Dyer. Unifier Dyer is a PhD candidate in the Department of African Cultural Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Their dissertation focuses on the archetype of the healer as a transitional figure throughout African and diasporic women's literature. Unifier's research interest is in indigenous knowledge systems in contemporary literature and creative works on and by women. They are co-editor of Ubuntu and the Everyday and have published in the use of indigenous forms of redress for transformational justice in contexts of fragile democracy. Unifier holds an MA in African literature at the University of the Witwatersrand, South Africa, focused on apartheid literature and silence as a weapon of self-affirmation. Our second speaker today is Rhoda Malgas. Rhoda Malgas is a lecturer and PhD candidate in the Department of Conservation Ecology and Entomology at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. Her teaching and research center on social ecological systems, a conceptual coupling of the nature-human nexus that allows description, analysis, and design of natural resource use for conservation-oriented outcomes. Rhoda serves on several boards and trusts dedicated to conservation action and development. So today we are going to hear papers from both of our participants. I will then reserve a small amount of time for comments, and we will move to the question and answer section of today's discussion, which I hope will be robust and very interesting as we bring together seemingly disparate fields to discuss Ubuntu in a variety of contexts, but I think we will find some interesting connections. So without any further ado, I will turn the webinar over to Unifier for today's first paper.
Thank you, John. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. Thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to thank the organizing team, Upenyu, Nicole, Mosa Paddy from Stellenbosch. I'd like to thank Jamie Mason too. I'd like to thank all of you who are joining us from wherever you are in the world. And I'd like to give thanks to those I work with, my guardians, my ancestors. My presentation today is titled Ubuntu and Afro-Black Women's Experience as Epistemology. When we think of Ubuntu, the maxim that comes to mind is Umuntu Umuntu Ngabantu. This is Nguni for a person is by virtue of their relations and connections. The image that often comes up when we think of Ubuntu is that of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And if you look at the top right, that image in and of itself is quite male-centric. We have in the middle of the photo, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. We have to his left, Alex Boren, and to his right, Reverend Bongani Finga. And I want to juxtapose this with the image of Winnie Madikizela Mandela, who herself stands before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for 9 days. And she stands as the archetypal figure of the mother of the nation. And yet when she's at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, what she does is she contests the idea of having to be placed on the same level as those who have committed atrocities under apartheid. And she remains in South Africa a force of resistance against a South Africa willing to bury pain in the bodies of those who had to withstand the greatest traumas and pain. And through her, we are made to recognize that the path of getting full personhood is intertwined with the need to heal and not perform. So I'd like us to keep these two images in mind as I speak through my presentation today. Now, Ubuntu is a philosophy that resonates not only throughout the continent, in places like Zimbabwe with Hunu, or in East Africa in the Swahili language through Utu, but we also find concepts that resonate with Ubuntu across the world. Examples being the Hawaiian understanding of Ho'oponopono and Razamblanche from the Caribbean Creole. When we're thinking of Ubuntu, we have to ask ourselves the question what it is and what it is not. This allows us to really situate Ubuntu. It's true that Ubuntu as a concept and concepts that resonate with it have been usurped by nationalism and nationalist rhetoric. We find this indeed in South Africa, but we also find it in the works of Julius Nyerere's Ujamaa, in Senghor's idea of negritude. We find it in Steve Biko's Black consciousness thinking. So there is indeed this connection between concepts that resonate with Ubuntu and nationalist rhetoric. Oftentimes, Ubuntu is also caught in the clasp of being considered as traditionalist. And this is because Ubuntu can function within a patriarchal state and a patriarchal system, and yet its principles are not necessarily patriarchal in and of themselves. Ubuntu is often also quite male-centric. If we think about those who are writing about Ubuntu, if we think about the literature that exists, even if we think of early literature, but by S.E.K. Ngai, or in East Africa by Shaban Ben Robin, then we think of the principles and tenets of Ubuntu as being written by men. And yet there are people like Noni Jabavu who writes Drawn in Color, and she refers very much to it. We also have figures like Miriam Makeba in my story who premise their thinking on Ubuntu. So this is not then wholly true. Ubuntu is also oftentimes read within ideas of social humanism. And so it becomes quite anthropocentric. And the idea being that human is central, human and man, in fact, is at the center of our thinking. And I'd like today to have a sort of think beyond this. In fact, Ubuntu, if we look at its tenets, is non-dualistic and it's biocentric. Tamale references Mekada Graham in her recent work, Decolonization and Afrofeminism. And she says there, I quote, "Within the cosmic perspective of the African-centered worldview, all elements of the universe, people, animals, and inanimate objects are viewed as interconnected." So this idea of interconnectedness then reaches beyond just human interaction and engagement. And I think it's important for us to think of Shoenke's idea of the human challenge being there to allow for cosmic adjustment. And this human challenge being the fault of human beings. And so the faults of humans, the ills that they create, in fact, enable a kind of cosmic adjustment. So I presented the archetypal image of what we could think of Ubuntu through. And here is another image by the photographer Fabrice Montero. And this is an image of a djinn wrapped in human garbage. And this djinn seems to reach out to humanity. So I'd like us to think about, to have this image in our minds now, as almost a replacement, to think about this interconnectedness between humans, nature, and beings beyond the human realm. We could ask then, where does Ubuntu operate? Following the logic of interconnectedness, Ubuntu exists in a cyclic worldview. Here exists the living, the non-living, and the non-living include ancestors, spirits, gods, deities, and the unborn. So the three that we have then are the living, the non-living, and the unborn. And if we look at the diagram on the right by Nwando Achebe in her recent work, Female Monarchs and Merchant Queens in Africa, she depicts this brilliantly here, this connection between the spirit world, the physical world. And if you look at the center there, we have priests, priestesses, diviners, the spirit mediums, those who I would say are in the transitional. And so the three phases, the living, non-living, and the unborn, are linked by the transitional, the space between. And this then encompasses the interconnectedness that Ubuntu speaks to. It's connected to our moral obligations and relationality. So one's moral obligations as one lives in this world are observed by those you live with and around, and your actual personhood is only fully realized in the ancestral realm. Your personhood, your full personhood is only realized once one passes. There are three interventions that I am going to be looking at today interventions by three feminist scholar practitioners. And what these scholar practitioners offer us is an operation from outside of the state institution and re-establishing our relationships, whether they be class, self, and with land. And what question this generates for us is, what does it mean to be situated outside? This being outside of either state institutions or university institutions. The interventions that they offer us are also about creating knowledge and functioning from what one of the scholars I'm going to be looking at calls the sacred through spiritual consciousness. Another intervention is the acknowledgement of women who use Utu or Ubuntu principles in their work. And another is that their contributions amplify the overlooked significance of spirituality in the personhood of Ubuntu. And what these feminist scholar practitioners do is they centralize their work on the spiritual. So they centralize on, or they have us think quite significantly about ancestral connections, the body, and healing. The first feminist practitioner I will look at, scholar practitioner I'll look at, is Patricia McFadden. And Patricia McFadden actually operates from outside of the institution. She's someone who's worked within the university space. She's worked in nationalist sanctioned women's organizations, and she makes the concerted effort and decision to work outside of these spaces, to work from the foot of a mountain in Eswatini. And she situates herself within her garden. She comes up with a theory of contemporary feminism or contemporarity. And the tenets of this are radically thinking about pleasure, recognizing one is born with everything they need and that makes them dignified, a brave and complete break with neoliberalism and a neocolonial agenda that has women collaborate, sometimes unwillingly, with patriarchy, and forming solidarity among women of different paths. The second scholar practitioner I'm interested in is M. Jackie Alexander. She is the head of the Tobago Center. She is a devotee of Orisha. She practices yoga and meditation, and she situates herself too from outside of the institution and in the space where she engages her students with the Tobago Center, which focuses on herbs and medicinal plants and the conservation of forests. There are two major questions that she asks in a theory of hers that she steeps in the sacred. And these two questions are, who do you think with and who do you who do you work with and who do you walk with? And in answering these questions, she situates herself, and she situates in her major text, Pedagogies of Crossing, alongside feminist writers of this bridge called My Back. And she says that these women are important because they are the gift of vision for her. The space of the sacred that she works in is important because of how then she can work with these women, and how she says that it's very important for us to move away from mythologies that separate us. And so the sacred connections that we have with one another are something that she centers in her work, Pedagogies of Crossing. The second question that she asks of who do you walk with, she goes through in her text by thinking about the idea of the crossing, and the crossing being the transatlantic slave trade, the forced movement of people from the continent to the Americas. And what she says that is that when people move, they move with their gods, they move with their pantheons, they move with their knowledge of where they not only come from, but their epistemologies. And in order for her to be able to work with these, she calls upon memory and what Saadia Hartman calls critical fabulation. And critical fabulation is really the imaginative work that's done within an archive that silences voices, marginalized voices. And it's important for Jackie Alexander to do this because she works on the figure of a former enslaved ancestor and an ancestor who's not a blood ancestor. And this ancestor is Katsimba. And Jackie Alexander can only see and hear and know the story of Katsimba once she works outside of the archive and once she uses memory and critical fabulation. And she says that it's impossible to do this work of memory without the body, that the body is a repository of memory that is integral to the work that she does. All of this for Jackie Alexander cultivates what she calls spiritual consciousness, a consciousness of the fact that the self needs to be in community. And this self that needs to be in community is not, in fact, this preoccupation with self in the way that we see it, for instance, in sort of New Age spiritualism. The third feminist scholar practitioner I'm interested in is Mary Kinyanjui, for what she offers us if we're going to be trying to think through Ubuntu. And she offers us what she calls Utu feminism. Mary Kinyanjui is a Kenyan geographer, and she resists a lot of the ways in which her own field silence women. And she does this by focusing on what is called the informal economy, and in fact, looking at the principles that women use in the informal economy. And these she calls Utu feminism. So she looks at the way that we can make use of knowledge in gendered spaces. And she says that part of this work is healing with women. And she herself has to do this after she undergoes physical and psychological trauma. And the work that she needs to do to heal, she does with women. Now, Utu feminism, she says, and I quote, preserves and transfers women's logic, norms, and values of nurturing care, creating solidarities and commons, intergenerational connectedness, and transfer of knowledge and resources to communities and across generations. It counters the exploitative global patriarchal capitalism knowledge, unquote. And she goes on further to say that Utu feminism is a revolutionary mechanism which aims at transforming the foundations of the masculine operations in the household and community using nurturing, solidarity, sharing, reciprocity, self-reliance, individual and group agency norms, and ethos. And I think what's very interesting about focusing on Mary Kinyanjui's work is the fact that she is quite aware of the shortfalls of Utu once it finds its way into state rhetoric, but she finds use in it because of the fact that women actually take on Utu principles in their everyday lives. So it sort of turns on its head this idea that Utu is supposed to be a burden for women. So from these scholar practitioners, what do we learn? We learn the ways feminists are practicing principles of Utu and memory, the body and imagination, to work outside of institutions of neoliberalism or neocolonialism. We also learn that the state has used Ubuntu rhetoric, yet women hold it within their hands. This, though, should not be confused with women bearing the burden of peace building. Alexander also tells us that indigenous knowledge is not an alternative knowledge as it exists in and of itself. And I think this is important because oftentimes when we think of Ubuntu or Utu, we bring it in as an alternative to neoliberalism or neocolonial institutions. And in fact, it exists in and of itself in its own right. We also see that Ubuntu is contemporary, and we see this, for instance, in how, for instance, Dr. Phumzile Mompe speaks about using hashtag Black Girl Magic in the work that South African women are doing in business, where they are bringing Ubuntu into business. And it seems like these two are two contradictory concepts, but women in fact bring Ubuntu into these spaces that ordinarily we wouldn't consider it to fit into. And in fact, this is quite a poignant issue right now. If we think of the fact that in South Africa, we have businesses or retail stores like Clicks that are still finding space to generate adverts that position Black women's hair and image as unmanageable against that of white women. So the bringing in of Ubuntu into business spaces that Black women are doing then becomes very important. So we return then to Umuntu Ngabantu, and I'd like us to think of Ubuntu as our willingness to acknowledge our interconnectedness beyond other humans and to see the ancestors, spirits, animals, plants, rivers, oceans, and skies we exist alongside and in the presence of. And to think of Ubuntu as being in being. I have questions now that I'd like us to consider and ponder, and hopefully you can all help me with. And these questions, in light of this Ubuntu dialogues being around institutions and museums, the first question I have is, what does working within an Ubuntu philosophy entail? Can we think of living museums and therefore pay more attention to the spaces Ubuntu exists in? Where are these, can we think of living museums, pardon me, and therefore pay more attention to the spaces Ubuntu already exists in? Where are these spaces? And I'm thinking of Zwifo, which in Tshivenda are sacred ecological sites. And then another question would be, and who are the experts within these? And the experts within these, I'm saying, are womaine, who are healers. Another question is, what are some of the violence and woundings we carry when we situate ourselves within state or private owned and managed museums anywhere in the world? And finally, to whom do we owe the work that is done inside the institution, academia, or museums? Thank you.
Thank you to Unifier for that fabulously interesting paper, and I hope it has generated a lot of thoughts and questions among the audience members. We will turn now to Rhoda Malgas, who will be presenting a paper as well.
Thanks, John. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry, I'm just looking for, oh, there we go. Okay. So I'm sharing my screen with you. Okay, so it's afternoon here, half past 3, so hello to everybody. I'm a PhD candidate at Stellenbosch University and also a lecturer in the Department of Conservation Ecology and Epistemology. And I just wanted to dedicate this talk to the Elmores and the students of the Small Things Fund, which is an organization I run for first generation student support, and to my people. So I feel highly disqualified to talk about Ubuntu. I am trained in the natural sciences, and Ubuntu is hardly something that I read about in any journals or conservation ecology books over my career of 20 years or so. I don't speak any Nguni languages. I was born and bred in South Africa, but thanks to apartheid, I don't know any Nguni languages. So I don't even have a linguistic perspective from which to speak about Ubuntu. I also have no cultural reference for it. I'm in South Africa what we call a colored woman. I grew up in the Western Cape. So I suppose mixed race is probably one way to understand it. But again, although I'm born and bred here and can trace my genealogy 4 generations on both sides of my parents to Africa and South Africa, my lineages stretch over 3 continents. And with only English and Afrikaans and understanding of Germanic languages, so Dutch and German, Belgian to lean on. I've got no cultural or linguistic reference for Ubuntu. And so I feel particularly outside of the kinds of ways that Ubuntu is framed in the literature as I've now come to it. And I'm quite convinced that I still am not quite sure what Ubuntu is, but I would like to invite you on my exploration of whether Ubuntu isn't perhaps expressed in nature. And that is from my view as a conservation ecologist in African Fynbos, which is one of our oldest vegetative lineages in Africa. So I looked up what Ubuntu means. I know from my friends, my Xhosa and Zulu friends, kind of from their descriptions, what is meant by it. It seems to speak to qualities of human virtue, but also things like compassion and humanity. And I think this is probably how Unifier was talking earlier about how it's framed in the TRC, this thing about compassion and forgiveness. So that's one view. But I was thinking for myself, I just did a little bit of a brainstorm about what Ubuntu means for me. I grew up on the Cape Flats in Cape Town. In 1994, I was about 16 years old, and I grew up in the Mandela age when things like Ubuntu and Desmond Tutu's speeches on the news and radio were the kinds of ways that my understanding of Ubuntu was framed. So I understand it to be about relationality, something about interconnectedness of components or entities in a system or in a space. I understand it to be a sense of community. Certainly at the time when I was growing up, there was this whole thing about community, something that I knew from growing up, but something that was becoming more and more used in the news and in social media at the time. It says something about intrinsic value, this thing about, I think it's a crude English translation because I don't think it does full justice to the way of what Ubuntu really means, but this thing about I am because you are, that means that it implies that there's value just in your being and in my being. Not because you are so-and-so or are this and that, but simply that you are. So it speaks to intrinsic value. It seems to speak to interdependency, such that one entity needs the other to live and survive. In ecological terms, we talk about fitness. So for a species to live, survive, and reproduce, it needs other species. So interdependency in that way. And then mutuality in ecology, obviously we talk about mutualisms, like when species coexist. But I was also thinking about how mutualism, the way that I understand it with Ubuntu, is that there's never a deficit in the greater scheme of things, and that the total sum of things is bigger than the things that were summed. And then the ebb and flow of give and take. I'm thinking about resource fluctuations, for instance, in my own discipline. And then lastly, I understand it to be a spiritually imbued human quality. I'm a Christian, so for me, God-given gift, some kind of divinely inspired capacity to see and experience injustice with a purpose to transcend it. I'm not talking about a blanket kind of washing over and not taking full cognition of injustices and woundedness, but some kind of deep capacity to transcend those kinds of injustice and woundedness. So these are my personal understandings of Ubuntu, and that's how I came to the topic, but also started reading to see what I could find. Now about my own discipline, I'm trained in the natural sciences, actually as an archaeologist. So Unifier, when you talked about archaeology just now, my ears perked up and I thought, there's something that I know about. But just the definition of ecology, then the branch of biology that deals with the relations of organisms to one another and to their physical surroundings. And I just wanted to make this connection about the relationality and why I think Ubuntu might be expressed in nature. So I would like to invite you to where I'm at the moment. So I'm sitting in Stellenbosch, but Stellenbosch is about 50 kilometers east of Cape Town. And this is the view down Lion's Head. I just wanted to show you what a Fynbos community looks like, and a community in the sense of ecology. So this is probably taken in spring because things are flowering. should be Table Bay down there. But this entire mountain ridge would be covered in what we would call a Fynbos plant community. So different species making up a community. This is our national flower, Proteus cineroides. It's called the fire protea. It comes up after fire and is fire stimulated. Very charismatic flower. And just even in this one flower head, there's so much interaction taking place. There are mites and other little arthropods living inside of this, and each one of these little hairs would be a flower. So we call this a flower head. This that looks like petals is actually not petals, they're modified leaves. And so just a whole lot of interactions. I think for us as ecologists here in the Fynbos, when we look at a flower head like this, we are seeing a gazillion interactions between things at the same time. And so no landscape is boring for us, because we know and understand that to make something like this is ecologically so expensive in a nutrient poor and soil, in a nutrient poor environment that is, there's low phosphorus, low nitrogen, and then to be able to make not only a fire protea, but 9,500 other species like it, all doing their own thing and all interacting with one another. For that reason, the Cape Fynbos is part of this, as part of the Cape Floristic region, is known as a biodiversity hotspot in the world. And then just something else about Fynbos that you might know is that you will see that all the leaves of these plants, so we've got Leucospermum cordifolium, otherwise known as the pincushion protea. We've got Chondropetalum tectrum, which is thatch, so roofs of houses get made with this, and also brooms of another species, brooms get made with it. And then we've got an Erica species down here. You'll see that they're quite fine leafed. Their structures are fine, and that's partly because they are tinder for fire disturbance. I know in California, for instance, you guys are used to wildfires occurring there. Australia, the same. So these vegetation types across Australia, South Africa, and especially California are similar because of their lineage roots and how they evolved. So all fine-leafed, all of them, and but different species of the 9,500 that we know in this region. So just a few numbers there. We're talking about an area of about 90,000 square kilometers. It's just this region, this purple region down here. I'm kind of parked in this little spot over there. And we've got these 9 provinces across South Africa. The Fynbos vegetation is concentrated in the Western Cape. It spills over a little bit into the Northern Cape in this region over here, and then into the Eastern Cape. But even at this level, at the biome level, there are interactions between vegetation types. So Fynbos interacting with succulent karoo, Fynbos interacting with Albany thicket, even in these transition zones. There's lots of interaction and also different kinds of species that occur down here in the west, in the southwest. I said that we're talking about 9,500 species, up to 70% of which is endemic. In other words, 70% of these 9,500 species are not found anywhere else in the world, and so they're unique to South Africa and unique to the Fynbos. We make up about 10% of South Africa's share of the world of biodiversity. We are one of 6 Mediterranean type ecosystems of the world. And that means that when everybody else is having their hot, rain during the warmer months, which would make sense for plants, we have plants that have to deal with cold, wet winters and long, hot, dry summers. So that would be quite a difficult environment for plants to be. We also have low nutrient soils that are derived from sandstone, and that's a mix of quartzite and other low nutrient soil types. So low in nitrogen, low in phosphorus. Nitrogen and phosphorus are 2 of the nutrients that plants need to survive. So we don't even offer much by way of food for the plants. And then lastly, if you were a plant, you'd also have to contend with cycles of fire disturbance. We have natural fires every 10 to 25 years under usual conditions, but with climate change and now in the Anthropocene, we're seeing those fires occurring more regularly, and that changes vegetation structure and also the vegetation communities. But that's the Cape Floristic region in a nutshell. So having thought about Ubuntu and these ideas that it has to do with relationality, community, mutuality, interdependency, intrinsic value, and that to my mind it has some kind of spiritually imbued quality or precipitates that, I was thinking about semantics, just words that I could use from ecology where these kinds of things are reflected. And certainly there's a branch of ecology called phytosociology. So we've borrowed the sociology part from the social science colleagues, and this is what we would call a Fynbos community. There are probably at least 10 species that I can see here, but even apart from the ones that we can see, there are likely to be many more. And we're not discounting the underground organisms, so the vast array of species in the soils that facilitate nutrient cycling and all kinds of things. So just a snapshot like this, again, already starts to speak to probably hundreds and thousands of ecological interactions between plants, animals, arthropods, birds, and so on. So that would be a plant community. And just something from, for the kind of, I don't know if there are ecologists in the audience, but I'm taking those same 3 species that we talked about earlier, Leucospermum, Erica, and Condophyllum. This would be in the Proteaceae family. You're probably familiar with Proteas. Another would be Erica, which is a kind of heath, and then the thatch, which we call arestio. So this is something that's very similar to grasses and sedges, but it's the Fynbos version of a grass, so it's arestio. And some colleagues look at the plant traits. So plant traits are the characteristics by which we separate plants out. Things like, the shape of the leaves, how the leaves function and so on. And then the outcomes of those traits. And they had a look at drought sensitivity. The only thing I want to point out here is that even just with these 3 clusters of plants, proteoids, restioids, and ericoids, they fill different niches. This is a stylized version of the same diagram, but you can see that restios are quite good at finding niches and then speciating themselves into those niches. Ericas then take up a bigger portion of the top part, but just this diagram is symbolic of, again, the interactions that occur between clusters of plant communities and between taxa. This is what a Fynbos community looks like for rooibos tea. Now, I'm sure that rooibos tea is familiar to probably most of you in the audience. It's a herbal infusion, leaves and stems of Aspalathus linearis, that's the scientific name, are harvested and then fermented in the hot sun. This photo is taken in the Northern Cape, that's just across the border from the Western Cape. And this is the focus of my PhD and used to be the focus of my master's work with small-scale farmers using local ecological knowledge tied up in their cultural and indigenous knowledge systems, drawing on that for ecological indicators of sustainability, and then testing those against field and experimental data. And so, again, a Fynbos community, but this time with rooibos. And as you can see, rooibos doesn't start out red, it starts out green like all other plants. This is somebody harvesting there, but this is a wild rooibos plant community. So a lot of people don't know that rooibos grows in the wild. I think people assume that it's just cultivated. 95% of South African rooibos is indeed cultivated, so chances that you're buying the cultivated version in your stores is high. But there is a market for wild rooibos tea, which is being sustained by small-scale farmers who establish those markets based on their local knowledge and how to process the plants. And they now have a niche market overseas. This is the Dyer cooperative. So a Fynbos plant community here, rooibos plants here in the foreground, but these are restios, these are not rooibos. And to an untrained eye, they all look the same. But again, lots of other species in between here. And this is how I got the idea of, can I use rooibos as a case study perhaps for examining this idea of Ubuntu in nature. And this is the carpenter bee, Xylocopa cafra. It is a solitary bee, so it doesn't live in swarms with other bees. The carpenter bee is one of the pollinators for rooibos tea. So again, they're quite a probably easy to understand interdependency between species, extending now beyond beyond the community of plants, but now starting to involve arthropods. Of course, other ways that insects interact with plants is as pests. I don't have a picture here of a wood borer or anything like that, but I thought just to make the point, this carpenter bee is quite a big bee and it's very heavy. And the rooibos flower, if you can think of pea, any flowers in the pea family, it's called papillonoids because it's named after butterflies because of the butterfly wings of the 2 petals at the top. You have 5 petals. The 2 petals at the bottom make a little boat-shaped keel, and the anthers, the male organs of the flower, are protected inside the keel. So the keel makes a little bucky like that. Well, bucky is hardly an international word, a little bowl-shaped thing, and the anthers lie in this little boat in the keel. The weight of the bee as it puts its legs into the flower to open it up to get to the nectar is just heavy enough to lift, to push down the keel, lift out the anthers, and as it dips its head in, the pollen brushes over its back and sticks on these little hairs on the back of its neck, and that's how the pollination happens. So, complete interdependency and co-evolutionary processes that lead to not necessarily in this case host-specific, but they are also host-specific pollinators. And so just an example again of how even in evolutionary processes, these interdependencies play out. I think the greatest claim to fame that rooibos has, apart from its taste and how it makes you feel and the ambiance and all of the other things it's marketed for, is the fact that it has these amazing root systems. So this is what the plant looks like in the field. You may not think that there's much going on there, but the root system can be up to 5 times the length of the plant. You can have a little plant of 10 centimeters, but there's a whole lot of root going on down beneath you. And what's going on underneath is that you've got a deep taproot system that can get your water all the way down in the water table. And you've got a lateral root system that spreads just underneath the ground. Temperatures in rooibos country can go up to 46 degrees in summer. And so even if there was a little bit of rain from a thunderstorm, that water would evaporate very quickly off the surface around the plant. So the plant needs to have roots that are close to the surface that can quickly grab that water before it evaporates. So there's these extensive root systems. So that's one of the ways that it copes with drought in the hot, dry summers. Another way that it helps itself is that it has these nodules. Inside the nodules, there are bacteria that live in there, and those bacteria help to fix nitrogen. So nitrogen is available in the soil, but it's very little because these soils are so poor in nitrogen. But this nitrogen isn't even available. The little bit of nitrogen that there is not available to the plant in a way that the plant can use. So it first has to go through a processing system. And that's what these bacteria in these nodules do. So there's a whole cocktail of species inside this little nodule that help the rooibos plant to fix the nitrogen. It then gets taken up into the roots and the plant has its nitrogen. What is very Ubuntuistic about that is the fact that the nitrogen is not only available to the rooibos plant, but it makes it available to other plants in its environment. If it didn't do that, it wouldn't have nitrogen of its own. And if it didn't have that mutualism in place, it wouldn't be able to change the rhizosphere. In other words, the little clump of soil around the roots, it changes that actually, and for that reason makes nitrogen available to other plants. It also has fungi on its roots, so that's another way that it helps to metabolize food for itself, nutrients for itself. But maybe also another quite interesting thing, and so many species of rooibos, many species of Fynbos have 1 or 2 of these adaptations. That's not so wow. What is really amazing is that rooibos has a third ecophysiological adaptation, and that is that it can make these cluster roots. Cluster roots look like bottle brushes, and they are roots that kind of formulate very soon after rain. And what they do is they exude, so the root exudes organic acids into the soil. Those organic acids, and the root actively forages for potassium, exudes these organic acids, is able to metabolize that phosphorus, take it up into the roots, and again, now the plant is fed. But again, also now, because of the change in the pH of the soil, has now also changed the conditions for other species like the microbiota that live with it to be able to survive. So rooibos has these 3 adaptations. So those are the mechanisms by which it does this kind of thing. The other thing is that rooibos is one of the first plants to appear in a post-fire environment. So after a fire has gone through the veld, rooibos is one of the pioneer species to arrive. And some of it does arrive. You know, the seeds sit in a seed bank. Once the fires come through, the canopy opens up. There's now light, and the seeds are smoke triggered for germination. So again, interactions between even the abiotic and biotic. The other way that rooibos also reproduces is from buds at the bottom of the stem. So when the parent plant dies, these resprouters are able to resprout from the stem. And within the species, plants, there are some plants that can do reseeding. In other words, they come up mostly from seed. And then resprouters, these are plants that have the capacity to regenerate from the vegetative material at the base of the stem. Rooibos has both. So that's also quite special. It's not often that you find that kind of thing in one species. But in a post-fire environment, rooibos is what we call a pioneer species. So it kickstarts chemical processes for other plants, but also its physical presence and those resprouters that stay in the landscape. So they, you know, the parent plant dies, or rather dies back, but the rootstock is still alive. And just the presence of those structures in a post-fire environment captures seed from other plants as the wind blows. And so rooibos kind of sets the scene. Rooibos and other pioneering species sets the scene for what we call ecological succession, from which the vegetation then grows to maturity. So again, it makes room for, it holds space for other species and other plants. A true community player. Then lastly, I just wanted to say something about intrinsic value. The people that I lived and worked with for my master's work value rooibos tea as a beverage, but not just in the kind of sense that we are used to as a, you know, a health-giving product, but it used to be that rooibos was the only tea available during times of scarcity. So one of the stories I heard was about during the Second World War, when these people were not just separated from tea because of sanctions, but also because of the cost of black tea in South Africa. So relied on rooibos tea as a local beverage. So there's also a strong connection for these people with rooibos and the plant. In fact, in another paper by Sarah Ives in 2014, she talks about how the claim to indigeneity for these people have less to do with land and more to do with the plant itself. They chose to associate themselves with a symbol of indigeneity that was more fluid than just the fixed asset of land. So that was quite interesting. So there's value in it culturally for people. There's value in it that they share landscape with these plants, and not just over the last 30 years or so, or 60 years that rooibos has been a commercial product, but share landscape in the evolutionary sense, in that they are descendants of some of the First Nations peoples who used to roam these landscapes way before colonial times. There's also value in knowledge. So this is me, probably about second year master's, so that was about 20 years ago. And one of the small scale farmers that I met in that landscape at the time, his name is Quis. And here Quis is telling me about a bush that he used to harvest when his father used to send him out as a boy. These plants can go up to 50 years and older. And so again, a symbolism of generational ties and meaning in a family for him. Certainly in my own heritage, my grandfather grew up in this region. And I studied archaeology first before I became an ecologist. So these kinds of images of rock art in the Cederberg is not uncommon. In fact, the Cederberg, I think, has the highest incidence of rock art per square kilometer of like anywhere in the world. What struck me when I started working on rooibos tea as a botany student was that the color of the ochre that's used in the paintings is the same color as the tea derived from the plants. And I find these connections quite interesting, just from a heritage point of view. And then lastly, fire. Fire is a driver in these systems, and so is a disturbance that people have to cope with. But rooibos is especially adapted to fire, and so its ecological services are actually triggered and stimulated by a fire disturbance. Like Unifier, I also have a few questions that I've been asking myself as I've been putting these things together. I ask myself whether we could use this idea of Ubuntu expressed in nature as a way to reconnect people in nature from a conservation point of view, but actually also a little bit talking to what you talked about, Unifier, about healing. This is something that Leslie Glagransie at Stellenbosch University has written about before. I see that Ubuntu is often talked about in environmental education. So certainly a field where these kinds of thoughts are being explored. And yeah, the next question I was thinking about is this idea of human and natural ecologies intertwined. Now, as an ecologist, I can think of the chemical and physical pathways in which that happens, how that happens. But I wonder whether there are philosophical ways to think about it, or the epistemologies that we can draw on that would make those connections more explicit. Having now thought about Ubuntu like this, I often wonder what other words and concepts might be hidden in other languages that we've lost already, or in languages that still exist where the principles are still lived out. Ubuntu was just one that was chosen, but what about the richness of other words and other linguistics points of reference? I'm thinking about Mwabi, for instance, which was a system of justice in 15th century Zambia, I think, which I came across a few years ago. I'm also wondering, how do we, and when I say we, I think about myself as an ecologist, how do I reconcile different ways of knowing? I understand that there are limitations to my science, and when Unifier talks about spiritual dimensions and the space in between, those are things that I learned about in archaeology, about rock art, but they are not things that in Western science my ecological disciplinary knowledge allows for. And I'm wondering, what am I missing out on by not knowing other ways of knowing? And then lastly, also thinking about museum spaces, I'm thinking about how we express this idea of Ubuntu in nature. How do we do that in a public space? How do we do it in a way that is inclusive of all peoples? And even just thinking about the knowledges that people still bear in these landscapes, people who are quite at the margins of society and economic systems, but whose knowledge is so central to the conservation of these species and the cultures that go with them. How do we find a way to get that knowledge out there that doesn't appropriate the knowledge inappropriately, but also makes that knowledge an asset even for the people whose children are following after us and getting into university and other systems. So with the hands of a man whom I love dearly, who passed last year, Umpihen, I say thank you very much.
Thank you, Rhoda, for that fascinating journey through the Fynbos regions and for your paper. As we've said, we will try to answer the questions that are being placed in the Q&A. We've noted the questions that are there already, and we will continue to monitor that. But first, I would like to first thank both of our panelists for wonderful individual papers, and together, I think, a real building of this conversation around questions of Ubuntu. And so I want to give a few framing comments, although I will note that Rhoda stole the title of my comments in her last questions, which was, what other Ubuntus are out there? And I think that that might be a unifying theme from both of these papers in front of us. So I work in Lesotho, as Dr. Monson noted at the beginning, where the expression moto ki moto kabato babang, or a person is a person through other people, I am because we are, both limited English translations of that, is the shorthand conception of Ubuntu that many of us are familiar with, whichever language or languages we speak. But as both of these papers show, the conception of Ubuntu put forward through that shorthand is, Ubuntu is much broader than even this very limited human and now-centric conception. Unifier explored the connections across generations between history and the present and the future, the past and the future, through the lens of feminist thought. Rhoda explored the concept of Ubuntu and moved it from beyond simply the realm of human relations, or even out of a sentient need to be aware of the idea of Ubuntu, bringing the idea of interconnectedness and interdependence into the phytosociological realm, and in particular in considerations of the rooibos tea plant, which I will butcher its Latin name, Aspalathus linearis. Apologies to the scientists who are listening here. Bringing plants not just into relation with each other, but also with the ecosystem and the pasts and presents and futures of the earth plant biomes of Fynbos. In bringing out the temporal connection between the individuals, the communities, and the plants, both authors are practicing and refining conceptions of Ubuntu. The authors are broadening and also challenging narrow human and present time centered conceptions of Ubuntu that too often drive the conversation. Asking us who and what present conceptions of Ubuntu, asking us who and what the present conceptions of Ubuntu serve, brings up the uncomfortable reality that, as Unifier argues, Ubuntu is at present often a philosophy that serves to underpin exploitative systems and to whitewash over how the historical realities of the apartheid system in South Africa are not of the past, and often, in fact, still reflect the lived reality for many South Africans, and in particular, Afro-Black women. Both authors also use the body, defined broadly, body of plants, bodies of people, as a site for work on Ubuntu extended. Rooibos as the first to regenerate after fire, but in its regeneration, it's not just for itself. It actually benefits many plants in the ecosystem. In the regeneration, in combination with the symbiotic bacteria in its root systems, it kickstarts the phosphorus nitrogen cycle that allows more delicate plants to also regrow in the same community. Likewise, in Unifier's work, situating the relational aspects of Ubuntu in the body allows them to transcend the temporal boundaries of communities. It's only when the trauma of women's experiences is situated in the body, bounded and nurtured by communities in the present, and deeply felt at the spiritual level, that Ubuntu can manifest through the revelation of deep historical memories that link the past with the present and future through the intercession of ancestors, thus paving the way for future crossings over. In both of these formulations, Ubuntu becomes much more than simply a vacuous philosophy or a marketing strategy, asking everyone to get along, one that reifies existing social relations and upholds the economic and political status quo in the name of community. Rather, Ubuntu becomes a liberatory philosophy that allows the ecologically marginalized, the politically marginalized, the socially shunned, and the patriarchally oppressed to build and challenge all of these hegemonic forces through a combination of rootedness in the present, and I deliberately use rootedness, existing communities while also working towards a better future, whether this is an active process carried out by people or through non-sentient processes through which plants are working toward the survival of themselves and the plants that their seeds and roots may in the future spawn. So as we try to ruminate on the connections here and on how we can expand and rethink our conceptions of Ubuntu, there are two concepts that I think might be interesting to examine more deeply. One is simply the term or the concept of the grassroots. When we bring an ecological perspective to this, we take a word that many humanists and social scientists use rather unthinkingly to mean community organizations, and we re-examine what we are actually looking at when we think about the role that roots actually play on grass and other species. It pauses our thinking and asks us to refine what we are talking about when we try to talk about community. You know, rootedness can lead to better actual Ubuntu in human communities. And it certainly drives processes of diversification in the ecological space. Another concept that both panelists were talking about, whether explicitly or not, is a relational worldview, right? The hidden relations that we can uncover by thinking more deeply about how people, how plants, how communities interact in the here and now, right? There are social relations within the biome and the plant world. There are also social relations that extend beyond simply the people around us. And so Unifier's paper asking us to think about the ways in which people are related to their pasts, their presents, and their futures, and the reciprocal relations that are required to nurture all of those, asks us to again rethink what we are talking about when we talk about a relational worldview or relations between organisms. So to wrap up, I want to ask one sort of large framing question of both of our authors, and then we will open up the floor to audience questions. And again, you can be putting those in the Q&A while I finish up here, and we will attend to those as well. So one thing I would like to think about more in terms of Rhoda's paper, I want to hear more about these deep relationships, the interconnections between the plants, because I really do think that, you know, the plants are not just serving as models for humans. I think we need to take them in their own contexts and extend the concept of Ubuntu to the biome. But how do we apply a relational worldview with a temporal lens to an eco-community? Should we be thinking in terms of structural violence, right? Because while the rooibos plant is doing all of this for the ecosystem and for the plants around it, perhaps in the past it had to outcompete others, right? To lead to its position of prominence. Or am I humanizing the rooibos plant too much here and thinking too deterministically and social Darwinistically as a historian? But to think more about the temporal frame, right? Because the present that we have is only because of the events of the past. And I don't know how exactly you apply that to the ecological framework, but it seems like something that we could ponder more deeply. For Unifier's paper, I wonder how we go about with the work of healing in communities that might not yet be ready to do the deep work that your theorists suggest is needed to truly overcome and change deep-seated ways of thinking, either at the individual, the community, or the societal level. So is this healing a precondition for this work, or can it be the bridge that starts these processes? You know, for communities of whatever shape and size that have been affected by trauma, where is that starting point, and who gets to decide that the time is now or is not now to do this work? So yes, as we throw open the floor to questions, I see that the Q&A is filling nicely as I talk here. I will challenge us to find other Ubuntus, whether we are talking about different indigenous ways of knowing through different languages and different worldviews, or through the natural world. How do we find those balances? So thank you to both of you for that. And I think we will try to take a few questions and then let Rhoda and Unifier respond both to my points and then to some other questions that have been raised. So as I look through the Q&A, I see a question asking Unifier to clarify the question about living museums and violence. And I'm also seeing a question about the delineation of Ubuntu as sustaining interconnections between various elements of the universe, the living, the unliving, and the ancestral. This is especially important in refuting the notion that foreigners brought spirituality or perhaps religion to Africans. Oh, I'm sorry. It looks like the question about living museums and violence has been clarified. I'm sorry, I'm working sequentially here. And one more question maybe for Rhoda. The audience member writes, Rhoda, I'm largely clueless about ecological issues. Asking if you accept the label of colored as it was imposed through the apartheid system. Is it antithetical to the overall concept of Ubuntu? So maybe we'll let our panelists respond here. I don't want to dictate who goes first, but I think there's some for both of them to respond to here. I think you're still on mute, Rhoda. There we go.
Just unmuted myself. Thanks, John. I'll just go with that first question, that last question first quickly. These are such contested issues here in South Africa. For myself, for my own personal identity, I take no offense and don't, for me, it's quite neutral to be called a colored person because it differentiates me culturally in the Western Cape. But I understand that for others it is highly offensive and quite hurtful, actually. So it is something that I grapple with. I'm trained in archaeology and I'm trained in the natural sciences, and I know that race is just a construct. And in South Africa has been used in very painful ways in my own family and so on. So I think for me, the way that I think about it is that these labels don't define all of my identity. It's just a way. It's just a classification, and I'm just as happy to shake it off as I am to have somebody refer to me like that and not it doesn't affect me. In terms of Ubuntu, I do think, I said a whole lot of things about what disqualifies me to speak about Ubuntu. But I think what does qualify all of us to engage about Ubuntu is, in fact, that we are people all over the world. And I do think that Ubuntu is one of those, I saw it described now the other day by Doc Rivers, the Boston Celtics coach. And I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. It's even being used in sport in the United States. That's amazing. And I think the reason that it finds universal application like this is because all of us can find something in our lives and our experiences that we think, aha, I can connect with it, even if we don't speak the language, even if we live oceans apart, even if we're on different continents, and actually even temporarily, different generations. I think Ubuntu is one of those universal principles that we can all find some relation to one way or another.
Thank you, Rhoda. First of all, I'm so glad I got to see your presentation. Thank you so much for it. Thank you, John, for synthesizing everything and making it all make sense. You did a wonderful job. Thank you. And thank you to the questions from everyone who's bringing them to us. I think it's a wonderful way for us to really articulate ourselves better and think through these things with you. So John, you were asking about how communities heal and when, you know, who decides when is the time to heal, right? I wanted to address that first and then go into others. And Marcelo Motse, who's a South African healer, defines healing in a very important way, I would say. And she says that healing is about bringing two irreconcilable things together. So every time we heal, we are inevitably doing the work of bringing two things that seem irreconcilable. And I thought that was very powerful, because that's what's constantly happening, that we're constantly having to come to grips with either things internally or externally that are irreconcilable. And so that work then is something that is continuous. But also, I think one thing is that we have to think about the way in which time is conceived when we're thinking about healing. And the state has its own agenda for healing. If we think about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that starts from 95 to 1998, there's like a time limit for how nation states reimagine themselves. And so the project that the nation state has to perform is very different to the work that needs to be done in healing. And even if I think of Rhoda's paper, Rhoda, you were saying that Rooibos is Ubuntu-esque in the way that it offers nitrogen. And it makes it evident that healing is also something that is inevitable. Of course, it requires a particular kind of agency, and that's why I was thinking about the work that we need to focus on, that healers do. But there cannot be a specific time that we slot in for thinking about healing in the same way that the state does, because the state has its own agenda. And it has, it takes healing as a performative task that situates it within a very linear time spectrum. And if we think about healing, healing cannot work in linearity. It has no beginning point and it has no end point, because when violence is enacted, a very particular relationship is gone into, and that relationship extends across generations. And in fact, that violence might be a memory of a violence that came before. And I mean, I would think of it in that terms. You mentioned that there was a question around bringing foreign, this idea that religion or spirituality comes from foreigners. And I think that that's a very important issue to think about, because of how it's been draped in studies of ethno-philosophy, and how it's been rejected because of missionaries like Placid Temples, who comes up with this idea of vital force and therefore essentializes African spirituality. And I think because of that, it's very important for us to, like Rhoda was saying, think about language. Ask ourselves, what other languages are they? And Rhoda was saying languages that have been erased, right? Languages that have disappeared. And I would say one place that is extremely important for that work in healing is trance and dreams. You cannot erase the connections people have, because they play out in the body. They play out in trance that people go through. They play out in dreams. One can dream of a language and communication that they can't comprehend in the living. And so those are the epistemological bases that we need to start thinking about when we're talking about reaffirming African spirituality. And we're only reaffirming it because of the violence that's been done to it. Before, it didn't need the kind of reaffirmation that we need to give it right now. So that's what I'll say for now. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you both. Oh, I'm sorry,
Sorry, I just wanted to say something about, you asked me a question about competition in ecology, and, you know, did Rhoda take the upper hand at some stage? Interestingly, one of the things that, you know, evolutionary processes play out like that. Some plants at some times outcompete other plants and then develop traits, and so on, and so it goes, and that's how adaptation and evolutionary processes work. The interesting thing is that from that process comes the very healing elements that make rooibos a healing product. It is this capacity for adaptive processes, and in fact, rooibos is one of the, it's quite what we call plastic. It's phenotypically quite plastic. So you can, you know, rooibos plants can vary by how they look in the field, even under cultivation. These are selected plants, so you should be knowing what you're going to get. But they are so plastic exactly because they retain that capacity to adapt to their natural environment. It is what has made it last so long, and why it's so important to conserve these things in the wild, because their genetic plasticity is what is likely to help, especially in climate change and other disturbances as we go into the future, not knowing what to expect. So the whole point about sustainable production of rooibos is exactly to keep its genetic plasticity in place so that it can sustain its existence. But just to say that these natural processes of sometimes being the dominant species, sometimes being the one that outcompetes others, what is construed, maybe construed is not the right word, what is interpreted in social sciences, you know, if you made that analogy directly, would be, you know, violence, or, I mean, rooibos colonizes a post-fire environment. It's a very good colonizer. That's the whole point. And so, you know, so I'm careful about these words and just making the analogy fit, because I understand that in the current discourse, those analogies can be hurtful, and they don't, you know, and be a disservice. But I do think that it's useful to remember that in ecological processes, the very things that make it seem, you know, that we would equate with negativity in the social systems are the very things that lead to the very kinds of healing components, so metabolomics and the metabolites and the phytochemistry of the plant, that make it possible to heal a different species, humans. Rooibos has very many therapeutic applications, as you know, both as a food and as a cosmetic, as functional food. And it's exactly because of those unhealthy, socially speaking, unhealthy dynamics, which makes it possible for rooibos to be a healer.
Fascinating. And again, we're complicating the dynamics of Ubuntu and our understandings, which is our goal of being here. So yes, I think it's great that we're bringing in all of these disciplinary perspectives and challenging easy ways of thinking. I think that's important here. A few more questions from the Q&A from the audience. A question directed at Unifier. I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about how Winnie Madikizela Mandela was accused and treated in post-apartheid South Africa, especially as it relates to the TRC and its implied role of achieving Ubuntu on several levels. There's another question here about the Slave Lodge Museum, whose permanent exhibition is From Human Wrongs to Human Rights. It tells the story of slavery and hopes that visitors will develop Ubuntu values such as compassion, understanding, sympathy, etc. It would seem to me that the telling of this story is an act of healing. In fact, the acknowledgement of the history itself is the start of justice. I think that, you know, I think it's just asking for a response to that. And then one more question. With the adoption of religions like Christianity, many Africans would reject the message of Ubuntu that celebrates nature, the universe, ancestors, claiming it goes against their beliefs. So maybe how would we respond to that sort of line of questioning?
Thank you for those questions. I don't think I can do justice to them, quite honestly. So in terms of Mama Winnie Madikizela Mandela, there have been conversations recently going on after the celebration of her birthday, and the conversations that have come up have come from Sisonke Msimang, who's written about her, as well as Shireen Hassim, who's also written about her life and her political work and her political significance in South Africa, and her politics of refusal. And I think that for me is what is so important about her life, that there is a way in which she refuses the ways that the state demand healing be done. The performative nature that Ubuntu requires of the figure of the mother of the nation, but also on the bodies of women. And post-apartheid, she is situated against a large end of the spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, there is a great adoration and celebration of her life and of her contribution in the struggle. And on the other end, there's a great vilification of her, and the idea that she is, committed great atrocities. And this is interesting because of how it plays out for South Africa's memory of her and of women in the struggle. And the idea that she's either one or the other. And I think that part of the work is to reconcile this image of her, these two opposing images that we find. But Mama Winnie remains a figure that makes us have to ask the question of how we're going to choose to heal, and the fact that there are those who have great rage and great anger. And what do we do with the fact that we have to position healing and great and deep anger and pain and wounding together? So I think for me, there are more questions and there's more need for how to reconcile these than a simple answer. There was the question of sort of restoring, I guess, healing through retelling stories. I think that the work that a space like Slave Lodge does can't be complete without reconciling its own history. So for instance, Yvette Christiansen's Unconfessed, she writes a story about Sylvia van der Kap, who is a slave woman, or who is actually enslaved, coming from Mozambique. And she, under enslavement, does something very similar to what Toni Morrison explores in Beloved. So a mother takes the life of her son because she can't bear the fact that this child, or she realizes that the life of her child as an enslaved person is worse than death. So it's a social death. And one of the things that Christianity does is she situates the slave lodge in its history. And she positions one, Robben Island, as a place where former enslaved, or those who were enslaved were sent once they had done wrong, which is kind of ironic. How can you put, how can you place the law on those who you don't consider as even humans, right? So there's an irony there. But then she also places the slave lodge as a place where women were, were sent, but also were expected, but were violated because of the expectations that were placed on their bodies as sexual figures. So I think it's important for these institutions to reconcile, and then the question is, who tells the story? So I think that for me, oftentimes the question is, who is in the position of telling these stories? And that can assist us in thinking about how the healing is done in these spaces. The other question was around what was Christianity, and it rejecting the ideas of Ubuntu celebrating nature, the universe, and ancestors. One, Christianity has a very, very long history on the continent, very, very long history. And two, we don't often think about what concepts like Ubuntu do to Christianity. Oftentimes we want to separate things, from the onset. And I think that that separation is not organic, that's quite a synthetic separation. And so I think that the way into it would be to ask, what concepts, what principles, because if you come into, even if you undergo enslavement, colonialism, apartheid, like I was saying in the work of Jackie Alexander, there's an acknowledgement that those things don't get erased by those experiences. They get violated, they undergo great trauma, but they don't get erased. They might get effaced, but they don't get erased. And silence doesn't equate erasure either. So the question that I think we should be asking is, what principles of Ubuntu, what indigenous and rooted or endogenous as well ideas infiltrate into Christianity that Christianity has to adopt, right? We know, for instance, with the Zionist church that Christianity has had to adapt to the fact that those who are being colonized come with their own knowledges. And those knowledges might hide within Christian doctrine and Christian ideas. And that, in fact, is one way in which they survive. So I would say to sort of, to think of it in that way. And I think there are a lot of scholars who have done work on that.
Thank you. We have a few other questions coming in. Thank you to our engaged audience for sticking with us here and being an integral part of this lively Q&A as we plumb the depths of the arguments here. I'm going to jump in with one question of my own, and then I will take the two questions that are here in the Q&A as well. And I'm going to link the papers together again with a question for Rhoda. Unifier argues in the paper that human rights, the framework of universal human rights, is too limited a frame for women to fight for rights, and that an Ubuntu moral and ethical framework is more useful for that because of the limiting factors. And I'm brought back to an article I read about a river in New Zealand being given the rights of personhood, right? The Wangani River in New Zealand. And so I'm just wondering where you think your paper might fall on this, right? Should people who are looking to protect non-sentient ecosystems, right? What is the right frame, or are all frames the right frame to battle with everything at your disposal? But what are the advantages of perhaps using an Ubuntu framework to argue for conservation or for landscapes, the rights of plants, animals, rivers, etc., to exist along with humans? So there's one question there. Then from the chat, we have a question for Unifier. You've mentioned performative healing in contrast to true healing a few times. Curious to hear more about what you see as the role of the state in demanding this healing. What work does performative healing do for the state in terms of pushing its own agenda? Another question talks about Ubuntu in a Shona community in Zimbabwe, that Ubuntu is often invoked especially for what it stands against, attitudes, behaviors, and even ideologies. How might this aspect of Ubuntu be used to correct some of society's wrongs, sexism, racism, impoverishment, and the physical and emotional traumas they bring about? And then a final question that just rang in here. Does the scientific method have analog in IK? How does any indigenous scientist approach this? So some very meaty or vegan-y and weighty questions for the panelists here.
So John, can I jump in there with your question about the river in New Zealand? On my way, I was sitting in a little bit of traffic here in Stellenbosch on my way to the place where I'm sitting now. And that was one of the examples that came up in my mind about how people stood up for a river. And I teach on this, I use that particular example in my teaching when I talk about environmental ethics to my students. You know, where does the river's rights, where does the river's rights start and where do they end? Where are the human rights and where do they end, and so forth? I think, you know, in South Africa, there's even just in environmental ethics, I'm thinking of people who would pity the dogs in an informal settlement before they think to help the people. And but those also the people usually are lobbying for environmental, you know, the salvaging of some kind of piece of land or whatever. And so I think, let me start by maybe latching onto something that Unifier said earlier about how separations are sometimes inorganic, that they're not organic. And I think that the separation of people and environment is something that is artificial. In fact, we did an exercise recently with language, just language, and we were talking about how in English, people and nature are two different words. But there are languages, and I think that's probably true for Nguni languages, although I can't say that for sure, but where the words have slight nuances. You know, it's very similar words, and just a slight nuance separates them, and it's one of those things I refer to where English is a limiting factor. Our English, the way that English words, and maybe even Germanic words are languages constructed, is for separation. And those separations don't necessarily exist in other languages and in other worldviews. And so I think that probably I think people would have to buy into common worldviews first and value systems first before we can extend ourselves, especially in a diverse country like South Africa, into taking conservation questions further. And that is exactly why now in my teaching, I start with environmental ethics first. You know, to have a conservation goal at the national level with the State Department or whatever. As Unifier says, states have their own agendas and you have to work within a 5-year election time interval, whatever. But in the final analysis, generational memory of a river and what it used to mean, how people value that from a values position. That's the kind of story and storytelling, that's what sells conservation. That is how people construct that narrative, and then how ecologists listen to that. And I think certainly for me, as someone with indigeneity in my heritage, that is how I consider ecology. When I think about Fynbos, it's not just Fynbos from a clinical Western science the way that I learned it in my biology class. It's also with full cognition of my 1860 ancestor whose name I bear, who probably still spoke a Khoi language, but from whom I now have separation in terms of linguistics. But the place where she stayed and my mother's lineage to her, the fact that I bear her name, those are the things that are still present for me. And so when it comes to the conservation, even of that area, when I talk to people, I talk to them as a fellow family member. I talk to them from kinship ties and not just from the biophysical and chemical pathways that ensure the coexistence of species in a landscape. Yeah.
Wonderful to hear you, Rhoda. So what do I start with? The idea of this, the state and performative healing, right? So thank you for that question. I'm going to be a bit of a stuck record, but what I'm going to try and do here is, the thing about the state is, and state formation is, states are unapologetic and unafraid to usurp indigenous knowledge, indigenous epistemology, indigenous principles, but yet don't follow through. And that's not really going to be their function, to do that work of following through. There's a very interesting, more than interesting, a very powerful story, a recent story of a Congolese citizen who is basically placing the French government on trial, French colonialist government on trial. And what he does is he goes into a museum and he takes back the artifacts that he considers his. You know, of course, we have to think of it in terms of the imagined community that he's speaking to. But what the state needs to, I guess, have to realize is that performativeness that it does, whether it's performing healing, or whether it's enacting violences, it has to come to grips with, and it is held accountable for those. So we can think of the state's performance of healing as something that people will always inevitably take part in, either in unwillingly or unwillingly buying into or resisting. And so when Mwazulu is his name, when Mwazulu goes into a French museum and takes back those artifacts, and then of course faces the repercussions of that, right? Then we have to ask ourselves how far states go in their performance. And we also have to recognize that performance isn't going to be a straight line for them. The other question was around Ubuntu in Zimbabwe and Ubuntu being a negative. And I really like that question, because this takes me back to what I was saying about Soyinka and the idea of cosmic readjustment, that the value in our philosophies is not their idealism, is not the fact that they are great and grand. Someone who has Ubuntu is exceptional. A person who performs, a person who has Ubuntu, Mutu Aranabutu, is someone who is exceptional. You don't throw that word around and say, oh, this person was Kai or Unabutu. Oftentimes, in fact, we say Asimutu. They're not a person. We oftentimes, and I think this is important because of the reason why I use Shoinka is because of this idea that moral philosophies and things that ground us are in line with the cosmos. And the cosmos has no right or wrong, right? In fact, doing what we would call ill or wrong is very important for cosmic readjustment. It's very important for us to allow us to rethink our morals and to rethink where we are. So the value of Ubuntu is not in the fact that we reach it. The value of Ubuntu is in the fact that we constantly critique ourselves and we critique our systems and we critique Ubuntu itself. And Ubuntu is not some entity outside of it. It's not some abstraction. It is our daily being. It is how we wake up in the morning, how we greet others, how we engage in this very platform that we're on right now. It goes beyond whether we're using, you know, the internet or whether we're face to face. So I think it's important then to realize that is its great use. That we say what you are not in the encouragement that you will become what we hope to see. And we're not going to hold it against you, but you will be judged when you pass, right? Which is how then you attain your full personhood, by how you have related to others. But we need not see a problem in people looking and studying Ubuntu by what we are not. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you for those insightful answers, and thank you for those wonderful questions that raise these questions. This, you know, ways of thinking about Ubuntu as a process, less as a thing, and more as a process. Whether we're talking about the plants or we're talking about the human realm, or both and all. I do not see any more questions at this time, and as we approach the 11 o'clock hour here on the American East Coast, our time is just about up. So I would like to, I think, at this point, take the opportunity to thank both of our panelists for presenting us with really interesting and insightful papers, and the grist for some great conversation. And I look forward to seeing these papers come to publication before too long, because that is one of the goals of the Ubuntu dialogues as well, is to push forward to publication, to drive this conversation, not just in webinars, but also through scholarly conversations, and even beyond the academy and the ivory towers. So hopefully we will continue to push these forward. As we wrap here, I'm not sure if someone else is going to come in to formally wrap us. Is Upenyu going to do that?
I'm right here. I could do that in a way.
Okay.
So thank you so much, everyone, for making time for this webinar session. We are really delighted you were able to join us, and we want to thank the panelists as well, and John for chairing and moderating the project and the program for today. I want to end with just two quick announcements. The first one is we do have our next webinar session coming up on October 14, and this is going to feature two very distinguished speakers. We had been playing our a slideshow earlier on, but probably you missed it. But as soon as we have the flyer out, we are going to send the information out to you. But the first presentation is going to be some reflections on the Ubuntu philosophy and the historical geography of Pan-Africanism in South Africa. Then the second presentation is going to be on Gordon Parks, a Harlem family, and the limits of empathy. And that's coming up on October 14. The third session planned for this year is coming up on November 10, and we'll be giving you that information as it comes through. the last announcement I have is we will be posting the recording that we did today for this presentation on our Ubuntu Dialogues website, which is going to be going live very soon. And we will be sending you information as well as soon as it's available. But again, thank you so much. We do look forward to joining us on October 14th. And if you have events going on in your universities, in your institutions, please do share with us. We would love to participate in those events as well. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, ladies. It was a wonderful talk.
Yes, thank you to you both. I hope it was fruitful conversation and good food for thought.
Thanks, John. I think you did a great job.
Thank you. It took some effort to put them together, but actually I thought there were a lot of great connections between the two, and I think that, you know, I really do think that moving forward, they both have a real future for publication, high quality publication. So, you know, keep pressing forward with them, and I think Upenyu and the team will certainly be in touch about how the project can support you all as you move forward. And, you know, if you have specific asks or requests, don't hesitate to reach out.
Thanks, John.
Thank you
Very
very
generous.
much, John. Thank you
Yes.
very much, Rhoda. Thank you, Penny,
you.
Nicole, everyone. Thank you so much for this morning, afternoon.
And Rhoda and Unifier will be getting in touch. I think it will be great once we have settled down to check in and debrief and see how we can move forward. So
That
we'll be
sounds like a
getting
good
in
idea.
touch and seeing how we can do that.
Unifier, I don't know if you saw, but there's someone in the Q&A looking to get in touch from Stellenbosch. I don't know if you're able to see that or not.
Yes, how do I?
I think if you type answer, you can just add an email address or something there. And I see that this person is still listed on the attendees, so they might still be.
I brought them
Do you have
in.
a name?
You guys wanna
Do you have a name for
chat a
the
little
person?
Tandiwi Mariklane.
Can
I respond just straight to her?
If you.
I also brought her on if you wanna just chat a little bit here.
Oh,
it's Lindsay. Okay.
wait a minute.
I want to respond to Tanya, but just to her.
Oh yeah, it's copying the panelists as well. So.
Oh, okay. So this is on the open. Is she on the panelist? Is that what you're saying?
No, on the Q&A, if you look at the bottom right by share screen.
Yes. So I didn't want to respond there. I wanted to
Oh.
respond to her directly. Oh, okay. It's fine. They're sent privately. There we go.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
I really enjoyed the questions.
Well, I think you did a great job of answering, Unifier. If you were one of my students, I'd be so proud of you, but I'm proud of you anyway, just as a fellow South African girl.
That is so good.
You're so scholarly in your responses. I'm like, oh, I need to be like her one day.
So much because I really felt like I was rambling, but yeah, thanks for the.
John and
You did a
Unifier,
great job.
someone is asking if you can come to Stellenbosch to come do speak there.
Oh wow! It's Stellenbosch. Oh, Stellenbosch is so beautiful. Rhoda, you made me miss home so much.
So
actually,
When you come home, we'll hook up.
I was just missing home so much from your talk, and I loved what you were saying about the protea. And you really, there's this need for us to. I mean, I'm a healer, so we work with plants all the time.
Okay.
And what you were saying about the fact that you see the plant and you see like a gazillion things in it. I thought that was really wonderful, because we never really step into the world of plants. We just wonder, like, what can we get from them? What is it going to give to me? But walking into their ecosystem is something that's I think quite special in your work.
I think that's beautiful. I think the way that also, when I was in Cape Town the other day and I looked over the landscape of the Cape Flats, and I thought, I always tried to think what it would have looked like when our ancestors were roaming these landscapes, and so I had a bossy doctor for a grandmother, and I always think when she looked over Mossel Bay's vegetation, what was she looking for? I'm thinking species and ecosystems. How did she see that landscape, and what were the languages that she could use or draw on to say those things? It's just, so I love like another way of seeing like that, or just even seeing through
the way people language their space.
Yes.
Right. The way that what they use, particularly to be the geographers, the archaeologists.
Exactly. Like even the names of the things, because so we did a whole paper at the start, like just soon after my master's, about the local names for the plants, and in the Afrikaans names, even just the morphometrics of the plants, so you can tell about plant physiology and anatomy from the name. Exactly. Imagine in an indigenous language where the click or the the way that you say it and the nuanced way that you pronounce it in Nama or Griqua or any one of those.
And even how it sounds, right?
Exactly.
Because our languages are also very tonal, and they're very aware of how they sound. If a word is supposed to speak to a harm, it will carry pain in the way you say it. It will carry heat. What you're saying is so powerful, because it makes me think of the plants that we have and how we name. So when we name, the names for medicinal plants are powerful. In fact, they're very anthropomorphic. We name them in terms of what they do. Because we take it that the plant is the messenger of what healing we expect it to do.
Yes, that makes great sense. I've got a whole chapter on local ecological knowledge, but again, my linguistic limitations don't allow me further exploration of those ideas. But in this chapter, I've I've made the point that taxonomic and Western naming, nomenclature, is sometimes not even the best way to approach management and conservation, because it doesn't speak to the values of the people who are naming them differently. And so rather to hear and understand the names that people give, and then work from that as a common, so for us to change our language, just, yes, we know that this is a species and it comes with a whole body of ecological knowledge, but that local ecological knowledge also comes with an entire world of wisdom that we can't ignore for conservation purposes. Agreed.
Definitely.
When you come home, we'll hook up, okay? We'll have a couple of...
Yes, we will definitely. That is a most def. Actually, we should do so even virtually, since that's how people do it these days.
Yeah, you can educate me. It would be great.
No, I need your education.
Well, we'll do an Ubuntu thing and just educate each other.
There was a conversation in the chat as well. Someone from Stellenbosch wondering if we all might be able to do a webinar with them. So I gave them my email address and said we can talk, but they're from CPUT. I'm not sure what that.
That's the Cape Peninsula University of Technology. It looks like a Shahida Hendricks movie.
Yeah, so they might be reaching out. This was Shahida Hendricks. So, you know, they might be reaching out for a conversation with us as well. It would be webinar at this point, obviously, unfortunately, but maybe someday. So
John, you're always welcome.
Thank you.
Welcoming nation.
I appreciate that. So I have similar thoughts as I pass through the Eastern Free State on my way to Lesotho, thinking how differently the landscape would look if it had not been incorporated into the Free State in the 19th century, and how if it had stayed part of the conquered territory. You know, I reimagine the landscape as I pass through. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you all. I have to go now. I have to teach here later today. So it's been wonderful, and do stay in touch. And if there's any way I can help you, don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much, John. John, I wanted to ask for the benefit of Rhoda and I, is it possible for you to send us your wonderful notes?
Yes.
Because that could really help me as I develop my paper. Thank you so much for those.
They're probably less coherent in note form, but I will send along the Word document where I took the notes and put some framing thoughts onto it. So yeah, I'll be happy to send those out here shortly.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
All right.
Yes,
Take care.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thank you. Stay well.
You too.
Bye.
Thanks,
So
Unifier.
sorry,
Thanks,
before we go,
Rhoda.
sorry, bye, John. I just wanted to know who's Nicole Marie McSomebody. I can't see the rest of the name.
Mackenzie.
Nicole, do you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, okay, now
Hi.
I see you. Yes. I'm sorry. I just didn't recognize your name there.
Right. Yeah, I just stay in the background. I only pop in if I have to.
Well,
It
thank
was
you for
wonderful
your
seeing you
trouble.
both. Thank you
Thanks
so
very
much.
much for your role today. Appreciate it.
I am so happy today.
Oh, yeah?
It's done, right?
I was so looking forward to your paper, and I'm so happy.
Mine?
I'm so happy that even though in the beginning it was like, no, these papers might not speak to one another. I was very excited to see your presentation. So thank you.
Well, thanks, Unifier. I must say, I really, I didn't think I'd have that much to offer, and I really appreciate that you went first because you did all the contextualizing that I just don't have the vocabulary for. So I think it floated really well that we did first you and then me. And I think one of the common things here is the healing part. It's something I'm going to try to latch onto because, I think there's a theme there that is common to both our papers. And that is also universally understandable. People all drink rooibos tea because it's health giving.
They do. And what you were saying about the indigenous people who are fighting for rooibos, the fact that they are rooting themselves in the plant and not the land, I think is a really, really, really pertinent point. That because in South Africa, you know how the land issue, it's all about the physical geography, and to root your identity and your belonging through a plant, I think is something very, very powerful.
Yeah. So that's what, I also thought it was interesting. So you might be interested in the work of Sarah Ives. She's from Duke University, I think. Okay. And you can look up her book. She published a book called Steeped in 2018, I think. So Sarah Ives, she's an anthropologist. And she's the one who came to do the study on rooibos ecologies. Okay. And so she was basically juxtaposing white commercial farmers' identities and feelings of indigeneity versus the ancestral, people who are indigenous in the genetic sense, and many of whom deny that indigeneity because it meant something negative in the past. And then the plant, which by ecological terms is also indigenous. So this word indigeneity and how people connect with it in different ways in the same landscape, with the same plants in very different ways, and socially like water and oil. So I think you might find
the work is called Steeped.
Steeped, yeah. It's steeped like steeping tea. Okay. So Steeped, and then something about political, something in South Africa. Sarah Ives, Sarah Ives, Duke University. It's Duke Press is the publisher. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks everyone. It's 5 o'clock, so I need to go home to go and cook supper. Nice to be with you. Beautiful Unifier. Can't wait to meet you here on home soil next time.
Bye everyone. Thank you.
Ciao.
Bye guys.
Bye.